Alright. Hello, Vermont history students. Welcome to the video for Unit 6 of the course, which gets us about the halfway point of the semester. And it's appropriate that the halfway point of the semester is about the early 1890s, because that is fundamentally the turning point in the origins of contemporary Vermont's identity, because it is the era, the early 1890s, when there was a dramatic rise in summer tourism. And I am actually writing a book that explains better than has been explained before, in my at least estimation, how that process came about, or at least a key part of it. And so I'm trying to incorporate a lot of the book project into this summer course. I incorporated it into the course I taught on campus in the spring at Linden State, and that worked really well, so I thought I would try it out this summer as well. So I've been working very hard on the unit, on the outline, and also I wrote an academic article on this topic, which I put in the course materials folder, which I hope that you will read. It's there, and I encourage you very much to read it, because it sort of explains the story. And hopefully you can actually give me feedback and explain it to me. It's not a self-indulgent thing for me to be incorporating this book project into the course. I think it's appropriate for academics, professors, to keep courses evolving and interesting and new and changing, and this is my effort to do that. Plus, it's a really important story. So the book project thing, the story of how summer tourism exploded through Alonzo Valentine's program to recruit impoverished Swedish lumberjacks to replace French Canadians, comprises sections 1 and 3 of the 4 sections that are in the outline. Before I get to explaining that content quickly, it's Wednesday morning around 10:30, and I hope that some responses to the discussion question from Unit 5 will roll in. There aren't any yet, and I was a little disappointed by that. Let's keep the momentum going. There will be another discussion question, of course, for Unit 6, and that'll be this unit by Friday morning. And there's a town meeting, and that for next Monday. On this era, on the Gilded Age, and so please get the town meeting responses in. The last batch of town meeting responses were excellent. I got 4 people who responded, and Anna wrote and said that she has been moving and hasn't had internet connection, so that's 5 of you. And the one person who actually didn't respond wrote me an assessment paper, which was good. I've received 3 assessment papers so far, which is good. It's about time that the first one started to roll in. You know, write them up to the point of the course that we're in, if you know, whatever time frame sort of makes sense to you, and I don't want to micromanage the assessment papers. Just, you know, I think that appropriately now, maybe 1800 to 1850, 1860s would be good. If it goes much longer, maybe you want to go up to 1890 or so, and not deal with the complications that tourism brings in. But if you have any questions about the assessment papers, please write me, and I will answer any questions that you have. So here's the thing about, and I think that's all of the housekeeping where we're at, but please write me if you have any questions or if you're confused about anything. So this section of the course, this unit is comprised of 4 sections. The first one is my effort to explain the origins of the Swedish recruitment plan to you. Again, I encourage you to read the article, but briefly, there was a ton of concern among state leaders, state elites, downhillers in the Gilded Age about the decline of rural Vermont. Was it in decline or was it stable? That is the question that around which this era revolves. And in order to address this decline, in 1888, the state created this new position called Commissioner of Agriculture and Manufacturing, and the position was supposed to gather statistical information about the state and make recommendations about how the state's decline could be reversed. And the person who was put in charge of was named commissioner was Alonzo Valentine, who had been a major during the Civil War and was a wealthy mill owner. He owned a mill that knit women's underwear in Bennington. And he was appointed in the winter of 1889 and immediately began to send out questionnaires around the state asking people what kind of acreage they had and what kind of manufacturing they had, asking people for statistical information. Virtually no one sent these questionnaires back, but it is pretty clear that by that point, in the spring of '89, he'd already decided his plan to reverse Vermont's decline was to recruit Swedes. And why did he want Swedes? Well, because they weren't Catholics, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic bias in the state at the time. As the Yankees were departing, a lot of French Canadians particularly were taking over what Valentine called abandoned farms in Vermont. They weren't abandoned, they were for sale. There's no such thing as abandoned farms, but he called them abandoned, which made a lot of people in the state upset because it gave Vermont this, air of being completely like people are just walking away because it's so miserable. So anyway, Valentine came up with this plan to recruit Swedes, which he began to publicize in the summer of 1889. And the crazy thing about it, and this isn't in the article, but I wonder if either he was just a ridiculous person, because the idea to recruit Swedes to replace French Canadians is on its face absurd, or if he was a complete genius, because an enormous amount of publicity nationwide developed over this program, because it was like news of the weird. Oh, Vermont, which has tons of abandoned farms and is in horrible state of decline, wants to reverse its decline by recruiting Swedes. And so we got this enormous amount of nationwide attention, and the word got out that Vermont farms could be had really cheap. Before this program, before the late 1880s, there was some tourism in Vermont. Railroads particularly were promoting tourism as a means of getting passengers, but it was small scale. And the reason why is because most tourists in the Gilded Age preferred the sublime, really dramatic landscapes, and Vermont's just very pastoral instead. But as you get towards the Progressive Era and middle-class Americans in urban places are increasingly disillusioned by the problems of urban life, then there's more of a desire by people to get out into the countryside and revisit what America used to be, which perfectly positions Vermont to suit that market. Not just because it was backward, but also because farms were apparently very, very cheap. They were abandoned. And this is a huge turning point for Vermont, the growth of tourism, because up to the early 1890s, the worst thing about Vermont for downhillers was the fact that it was so backward. But when Vermont's backwardness becomes its greatest asset, downhillers get very confused. Then what they have to appreciate, wrap their brain around, is if you're going to sell Vermont's backwardness to tourists as a means of bringing the state forward, it's not like any other industry, because there's a state of diminishing returns. You can destroy the very thing you're selling. So, but Valentine facilitated the dramatic growth of tourism, not just by publicizing nationwide that Vermont farms were really cheap, but also he sent out questionnaires, and because there was a lot of publicity about the Swede program, he started to get them back, about does anyone in your town is willing to serve as a contact for letters that he was receiving, large numbers of letters from people around the United States about cheap farms. And so he built up a network of people that can be used as contacts in towns across the state for sending on letters about buying farms as summer homes. And then also he compiled a list of farms that were available for sale. And he packaged those up and turned them into the first ever comprehensive list of Vermont farms for sale. So that's the first section of the course, and that takes you up to the summer of 1889. What happened, though, is that this exists in the context, and it's very important that you appreciate the second section of the unit is on Vermont being Vermont's industrial state. And Vermont, but though it was quite rural compared to other New England states, it had industry. It had all of the problems, the modern problems that the rest of the United States did. In the 1880s, it's this era of great disruption, of Homestead is actually 1890s, but the Haymarket Square Massacre, the rise of the Knights of Labor, child labor, strikes, the streets ran with blood in the 1880s nationwide. And Vermont doesn't escape this. You can read in the textbook about the Vershire War. The Knights of Labor came to Vermont, particularly in Rutland. Vermont has child labor. It has urban poverty. I put up a picture of Winooski's Mills as sort of an example. And that's important that you appreciate that Vermont was not untouched by modern problems, because it's going to be sold as such, as untouched by modern problems, even though, of course, Vermont had its industrial problems and industrial sector. And so downhillers are going to have to deal with the fact that what they're doing is basically selling a false image of Vermont, up to the lie of Vermont, that Vermont's entirely untouched by modern problems. And that brings you to the third section of the course, which of the unit, which is about the actual plan. And what happened was Valentine got this guy he knew who was a Swede who had moved to Nebraska to come to Vermont. He toured Vermont, thought it would look great for Swedes, and then Valentine paid for that dude to go back to Sweden in the winter of 89/90. This guy John Nordgren, and Nordgren brought back from his hometown of Glava in Värmland in Sweden, which is very poor and rural part of Sweden, 55 Swedes. He broke them, and when they arrived, Valentine went and met them and brought them up to Vermont. There was 3 colonies, one in Vershire, which broke up immediately, one in Wilmington, and one supposedly in the town of Weston, although the Swedes needing jobs went instead to the adjacent town of Landgrove, where they began working in a lumber mill on top of Prue Mountain. And I'm writing about what happened to the Landgrove Swedes, and then what happened to Landgrove too. And the answer is, as you'll see, Landgrove got really fancy, and people like the Swedes couldn't afford to live there anymore, but that's down the road. So he brought 55 impoverished lumberjacks. There's 4 families that settled in Landgrove that I'm writing about. And on one hand, some people said that this was a great success and that Valentine was onto something really great. Other people thought it was completely ridiculous. Why, in Vermont, people were like, why don't we give the land to Yankee boys, to native boys? Why are we giving it to Swedes? And when it rolled around to the fall, the state legislature refused to renew the commission, and the program was over, and everyone agreed never to talk about the Swede program again because it had been so stupid. But the Swedes were still there. And not only were the Swedes still there, but also Valentine had compiled a comprehensive list of farms available for sale and a network of people who could facilitate the sale of those farms. And with the end of the commission, the Vermont State Board of Agriculture compiled his list and continued to circulate his list under the title A List of Desirable Vermont Farms for Sale. And to some extent they wanted farmers to take over those farms, but mostly, almost entirely, the sales of the farms were to middle-class East Coast Americans who wanted summer homes. And off you go. And to illustrate how Vermont had turned in that direction, the 4th section of the outline returns to a town called Wilmington. And briefly, it's this ridiculous story. Wilmington had taken a small colony of Swedes. I'm not tracing what happened to them, but the important thing was that Wilmington had just been connected to the Deerfield Railroad, and they had this lake which was called Ray's Pond. R-A-Y, was the Ray family lived on the edge of it. And deciding that Swedes weren't the future, Britain said tourists were. The people in Wilmington in 1891 decided that Ray's Pond, if it was going to be sold to tourists, wasn't fancy enough as a name, so they changed the name of Ray's Pond to Lake Raponda, R-A-P-O-N-D-A, Lake Raponda, which is, French or something very strange. But anyway, that's sort of like a illustration, a metaphor for what's going to happen to Vermont. Downhillers are going to start to tinker with it and make it more, sell it as being this pastoral ideal, as this beautiful, isolated place, when in fact it had all those problems of modern places. And also, rural places, of course, have high illiteracy rates, high infant mortality. Rural Vermont had its problems as well. But off you go with the sort of second half of the course, which is that now Vermont has gone, its backwardness being the worst thing about it to downhillers, to its backwardness being its greatest asset, and that's going to make downhillers very confused. And the problem with downhillers is whenever they're confused, they still do stuff. They don't sit back and wonder, they always do stuff. And so the era of tourism is kicking in. So that's where you're at, and please write me if you have any questions, and hopefully all that made sense. All right.